Folks, what you just heard was a musical rendition by Professor Fawzia Afzal-Khan, who happens to be in the studio with us. Welcome, Professor Saiba.
Thank you, Dr. Saab.
What are your motivations for making these series of rather contemporary videos?
Well, I was in Pakistan visiting. I was on sabbatical from my institution here where I teach in New Jersey, and I was in Lahore. And it was a very, I've always been interested in music, just, this music for its own sake. I've been trained in Indian classical as a young girl growing up in Pakistan before I came here. So, I love making music, and it was a chance, I had decided to perform. I was invited actually to perform at one of the largest performing arts festivals that is held annually in Lahore. It's held in Lahore every year in around November or so, under the auspices of the Peer. It's called the Peer Festival of Performing Arts, and a very large component of it is dedicated to world music. And so I was invited this year to actually be the opening act on their world music night for fusion music. So after that, I started thinking, I really would like to do something which I can also take back and show to my friends and colleagues, and maybe use it in some way in my work also. So I'm always looking for opportunities to bring my artistic interests into the classroom and into what I teach and what I research. So I was lucky enough to find a young recording artist who heard me, who said, why don't you come over to my recording studio? We can maybe experiment, with what you do, what you are singing, what you might like to do. And he was very interested actually himself. His name is Faraz, and the first Sacrifice, that particular recording was done in his studio in Lahore, and that came about because we were just experimenting with music, and I'm also a poet. And he wanted something which I could make more contemporary, but also rooted in the traditions of that area. And for a long time here as well, I have been working with jazz musicians, for example, in the United States.
Before we go to jazz, Saba, let me ask you, in that video that we just saw a little earlier, you talk about sacrifice.
Yes.
And you talk about gendered notion of that sacrifice.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit more about that, please.
Well, I think that, as I was saying, that when I started working with this musician Faraz, and we were, just sort of playing really at making music in his studio, I became very inspired one evening thinking about, these ideas that came up in the poem, which is really the basis from which then the music arose. That poem just came to me one night as we were singing, and he was playing some notes of different melodies on his keyboard. And I just asked him for a pen and pencil, pen and paper, and I said, I just feel like writing. And that's how the poem actually got written. And it came out of this, for a long time, I'm a teacher of a professor also who works in the area of women's studies, feminist theory, global feminism, and so on, and most recently peace and justice studies. And so I started really thinking, and I have been thinking about the issues that confront the world currently, and particularly this era of unending war and violence that we have been plunged into since 9/11. Not that it wasn't happening before, but it's come to the surface in a new and palpable and a much more frightening way since then. And that led me to think about gendered notions of violence. Would a woman leader of the free world, would she be any better at preventing the world from reaching what I feel is really an apocalyptic moment in which we can easily destroy ourselves and our planet? Or is violence turned outward really a male phenomenon? And then somehow my questioning led me to thinking about notions of sacrifice, and how we associate sacrifice primarily with mothers who send their sons off to war, and they're meant to be sacrificing for the homeland, for homeland security, and so on. Where do these notions come from, and where do they take us, and where have they taken us in terms of the world that we live in? So that's really what was playing on my mind. And of course, very ironically, after I wrote the poem, Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan got assassinated, and in her latest book, which she was working on at the time, she talks about sacrifice and the notion of Karbala. So I started thinking about, and people talked about her death as the death of a martyr, and that she was really, it's a sacrifice that she made for the cause of democracy in Pakistan and so on. So these things obviously were there in the air, in the atmosphere. I was picking up on them, and being a poet and a creative person, they somehow made their way into the poem and then later into the music itself.
Well, as I heard you sing your own words, your own poem, it called to my mind famous couplet by Ahmad Qasmi, मैं खुल के रो न सका जब तो ये गजल कह ली बिछड़ के मुझसे मगर तूने क्या किया होगा. So I think you had made a distinction in your elaboration between male and female expression of sorrow and sacrifice. Talk to us about the connection between sorrow and sacrifice as you see it.
There is a very deep connection. It's a complicated question, and I think probably I cannot answer it adequately, but I feel that there is obviously a deep connection, which I'm sure all of us can see, because sacrifice entails sorrow. And when I was thinking about, absolutely, and I do draw this distinction between sort of male and female approaches to an understanding of and the lived experience of sacrifice, that I think sort of generally, and speaking in obviously generalizations, because I think there are exceptions to this, that generally what we call not male necessarily, but masculinist is a better word, which has to do with sort of patriarchal, the notions that have evolved under patriarchal ways of thinking. That have been with us for so long, that masculinist ways of expressing or dealing with sacrifice and sorrow are quite different. And generally speaking, that notion, the masculinist notion, is more sort of sacrifice as something that can be seen externally, that can then be also validated externally, that calls attention to itself as a code of honor and something that is associated with male visions or masculinist visions of honor, which often then are visited very negatively upon women and women's bodies. And
you had talked about Muharram, I think.
And then in that connection, Muharram became a kind of metaphoric construct that I started working with in the poem itself. And also, then was visualized in the video that was made about the song and the poem. And in there, I've been fascinated by the self-flagellation, which is a form of mourning and sorrow, but it refers to the sacrifice of Hazrats Hussein and Hassan in Karbala. And it is usually men who are seen out there on the streets, in the Taziyeh processions during the month of Muharram. The Shias sort of commemorate really the world over that sacrifice made at Karbala, where the brothers both were they were killed for their beliefs and for what they stood for by the tyrant Yazid. And it's the women generally are observers. They have their own spaces where they express mourning and they beat on their chest, but that is not a spectacle. So in some ways, male sacrifice to me seems to be
more of a spectacle.
More of a spectacle than an internal thing. And that made me think about, when we talk, particularly the discourse around war is often sold to us as, we are sacrificing our young men primarily, although women have entered the armed forces, particularly in the West, in Western countries, certainly in the US. But it's really a male spectacle of violence, of war directed outward, and the sacrifices that men make. But then, by actually going out there and putting their lives in the line of fire for their motherland, usually. And so the motherland, interestingly, is the figure of the woman and the mother. And the background of Karbala also, you have the sisters Zainab singing about the brothers. And so the women's role is always about singing about or otherwise commemorating the sons and the lovers and the husbands who have gone off and lost their war. So their role is much more passive and more of the sort of visible mourning, but not necessarily of actually loss of life per se.
But Dr. Saba, it seems to me that there is one level that you've described. Then there is almost a pre-feminist moment of feminism that we see in Sufi poets. And there I think the recognition of this feminine voice becomes very important, because most of the Sufi poets speak in the voice of a female.
Correct.
Right? And I think that Ranja Ranja Kardini me appe Ranja hoi, Akho ni manu dido Ranja, heer na akhe koi. All right? So that's written by a male Sufi poet who takes on that persona and that voice. Let's talk about that voice. Why do you think Sufi poets felt that the feminine voice was more appropriate to a more committed form of love?
I mean, I think that for me as a woman, that's obvious. I'm glad that we had Sufi male poets who thought that way as well. But I think precisely because the feminine one is that part of what we have learned to call or name as the feminine, is that part of humanity which is associated traditionally with love, with compassion, with our urge towards peace and tolerance and getting on and getting on with each other. And I think that the Sufi poets that I know, whose work has inspired me also and inspired other activists in Pakistan whose work I have studied and with whom I've worked with closely on theater and on other aspects of performance. And they too have been drawn to Sufi poetry and the poetry of Baba Ghulam Farid and Baba Bulle Shah and others of their ilk, because these people are elaborating a vision of a tolerant, compassionate, pluralist society and ethos. And I think they couldn't have done that without drawing on that, what we call the feminine principle. And I think the mistake that patriarchy has made is to engender these visions or versions of human beings which radically oppose the masculinist or male on the one side and the feminine or the female on the other, as though they are completely separate spheres, very different. And so men brought up by and large under that kind of ideology tend to want to excise the feminine from their own personas, their personalities, their value system, and so on. And I think that kind of excision and distancing of the feminine from the masculine has led us really to, it's a simple or perhaps even simplistic way of putting it, but at some level I believe this very deeply, that that is precisely why we are at this juncture.
Wouldn't you say that in Punjabi Sufi poetry, the feminine principle is twice reinforced? First, by taking on the female persona, and then reaching back to the mother. Maini मैं किन्नू आँखां दर्द छड़े दा हाल लिखी लौ कलम दी माए मोड़ जे सकनी है मोड़. So how do we see this double reinforcement? Not only the poet itself takes on the persona of a female, but goes back to another female.
Because I think there is this yearning for the comfort and the security and those moments of peace that a mother's lap brings forth in the male imaginary. And certainly in the West too, people, psychoanalysts, psychoanalytic theorists like Jacques Lacan, who has then later been also, revised and taken, his work has been taken further by many renowned feminist theorists like Siksu or Irigaray, Julia Kristeva. And they have all talked about this pre-patriarchal, what they call the pre-imaginary of the male, that state of being that the child knows before entering into the language of the law, which is the language of the father, which excises the feminine principle. And it is that area where our desires are not necessarily vocalized, verbalized, but they are linked to the maternal body. It is that longing that I think our Sufi poets knew and understood much before Jacques Lacan came along and wrote about that.
Well, of course, don't we need to say that Jacques Lacan's critique is more appropriate and more valid for the West, less so for the East? And if you go next door to India, for instance, look at their whole pantheon of gods and goddesses.
Correct.
There, the picture becomes far more complex, and Western model perhaps is not readily applicable.
I think to that, to some degree, you are quite correct. But to some degree, I think that we also see very extreme forms of patriarchy in the East, in those societies which have, at the same time that they have this, kind of poetry, and certainly in India, where in the religion and the form of the philosophy of Hinduism, all the goddesses that you're talking about, that unfortunately patriarchy has taken root there in ways.
In Sati, for instance.
In Sati, for instance, absolutely. So, and then we see with the advent of a particular version of, in contemporary times, you would say that the Obandi school of Islam, which is linked to, sort of a Wahhabist interpretation of Islam that takes us away from Sufi versions, those kinds of patriarchal beliefs and models have not just disappeared, and they are in fact reinforced by these other models of religious belief in that region. And those models follow very much very similar trajectory to Western patriarchy. I don't think they are so different, and to that degree, I think the work of people like Lacan, the other French feminists that I mentioned, are in fact quite useful. And I mean, I think that also in terms of Sufi poetry, that while at the one hand I think it's fabulous and wonderful that their work celebrates the divine in the form of something that we might call a feminine principle that we see in their references to the mother and the beloved and so on, that at some level they also unfortunately reinforce, I think, a particular vision of the woman that is then just circumscribed by the role of the mother and the beloved. So they have their own limitations.
All right, we'll continue with that discussion. We are going to listen to a little more music, and then we'll take a short break. After break, we'll come back and talk about these patterns and to what extent they limit or liberate the female principle in all of us. Stay tuned with us.
When blood curdles to speckle the surface of skin's disease, who can say how deep the mottled hue lies in the underbelly of the bees, sacrificed annually? A rite of passage entering the new year. With tears and screams of self-flagellation, exotic blood of beautiful boys bursts through the chains of mothers and lovers, deep inside somewhere. Lost to this manly ritual of torture on display.
Welcome back. Today we are talking here to a multi-talented guest, Professor Fawzia Afzal-Khan. She is a professor at the Montclair State University in New Jersey. She is also author of numerous books, including Cultural Imperialism and the Indo-English Novel and the Preoccupation of Post-Colonial Studies. Recently, she has produced 3 musical videos. They are named Making the Sacrifice, Smokescreen, and Sacrifice. Welcome, Professor Saiba.
Thank you, Hazal.
Now, we were talking about your second video, Smokescreen. What is the difference between, let's say, Sacrifice and Smokescreen?
Well, firstly, I think is the field.
Or there's no difference?
It's on a continuum. I think I am working with sort of thematically working with the same within the same area, which is my preoccupation. I think with gendered roles, gendered behavior, particularly in the context of the socio-cultural background that I come from, which happens to have been Pakistan, and you know, now with the resurgence of a particular kind of very orthodox or extremist understanding of Islam, which as when I was growing up in Pakistan was really not the case. So my work is meant to challenge a lot of these binaries, if you will, between you know, male and female sort of behaviors, what is expected of a woman, questioning why, where does it come from, challenging patriarchal and religious and other ideologies that constrict or constrain the role of women. So in Sacrifice, I was definitely concerned with how do we as women, citizens, female citizens of not just any one state but the world, how do we try to refashion some of the things that have gone terribly wrong, and what can we bring to the table as women, you know, with our sort of being steeped in what we talked about as the feminine principle. I think and I there also had recourse to traditional, musically something very traditional, even though, you know, it was set against a track that has a very contemporary sound, but I was singing from Baba Bulle Shah's, one of his poems, and it was sung in the Kafi style. And now in Smokescreen, which is much more playful in feel, I think, I am singing actually a song which was popularized in Bollywood, in a Bollywood film, and the character that I play in Smokescreen sort of goes back and forth between a present moment in which he's singing the song with a jazz musician, he's playing the saxophone. So I'm bringing sort of Eastern and Western elements together because I think it's important that that is one binary that also should be challenged.
I want to come back to this East and West issue, but let me ask you a question before then. And that's the question of the tradition that you have studied, not only the musical tradition, but also the poetic tradition. In there, Najm Hussain Sayyid, in his book, The Recurring Patterns of Punjabi Poetry, has argued that the Sufi poet actually deals with the known and then suddenly surprises with the unknown. So the woman who is going away and she is singing the traditional Babla song, asking her father to keep her one more day and wailing to her mother and so on, but finally gives and leaves. Suddenly, in case of the Sufi poet, the poet refuses to accept the tyranny of the moment or the tyranny of the system.
Absolutely.
And therefore is always stepping outside of that known pattern.
So that's a wonderful segue into what I wanted to say. I mean, which is that I think I must be a Sufi, because really that has always been my impulse. And I think with the video, the second video, Smoke Screen, I talk, I mean, if you think about the title itself, it's a smoke screen, the things that we think are so may not be so. And it is a challenge, and the set pattern...
May I just interrupt you to say what you call smoke screen? Traditionally, Sufis have called them hijab. And that's why the very famous book by Data Ganji, Kashful Mahjub, lifting the veil.
Lifting the veil,
yes,
absolutely.
Lifting the smoke screen, so to speak.
So that, in a sense, is what I was trying to do very, in a very humble sort of way in this rather playful video, which I also want people to enjoy. So it's not that it has, some message like a piece of propaganda. It is a music video, but I think that if you look at the character of the woman, she is being followed.
May I ask you a question? Because you said there is no message, it's not propaganda, it's a piece of, I think you said music,
art,
video,
yes.
art. Do you think art has a message?
Well, I don't think that art should have a message that it wears on its sleeve, because then it wouldn't be art, then it should be called something else, a political tract, for example. But I think that certainly I believe in art or a vision of art that is linked to life. And if it's linked to life and it's linked to the person who is raised in a particular way and has her own ideas about, things going on around her and has experienced life in a particular way, has something to say, it will come out in that artistic vision. So to that degree, I think all art is perhaps political if we think of politics in a much broader way than as a narrow kind of propaganda. And so, to answer your earlier question about stepping out of the bound, I mean, I've tried in this video to step out of the Bollywood tradition, because I think when it opens, there's this woman who is singing, Bollywood song that would be familiar to those audiences, and so they might be lulled into thinking it's just going to be this video about a woman singing to a beloved, or because really the lyrics of the song sort of play on that. But what ends up happening through the course of the video is that she's challenging, the first setting is also military cantonment. And she's followed she's looking over her shoulder, and there is a man who is following her, who then picks up, her words, which we find out later that she's also a writer. And so she's running through the duration of this video, and in the black and white footage, particularly those moments. And she ends up at one shot in front of the Badshahi Mosque, and at that point, she's, one half of her is singing, and she's also talking on the cell phone, and at that time she's not garbed in a hijab or covered up as we, so there is that element of challenge, that who can say or who decides what is appropriate or inappropriate dress codes for women, and why should it be that there is this tremendous separation between what we call the sacred and the profane? Maybe there isn't. Maybe we need to look at the world differently. And then by the end, of course, she is also, there is a little bit thrown in the the character when she's singing at this cafe. She's reading new contemporary newspaper which says lawyers want to try Musharraf for treason. So there are these little political things that are thrown in there in this kind of very pastiche, which is a very postmodernist technique, to suggest that the video is multi-layered and needs to be read at a number of different levels. And then by the end, you know, the man who has been following her, we can see him like looking for things, looking for some way to perhaps get to the woman and to possess her through her words, through her music. But eventually he's dead on the floor and she leaves. I'm sorry?
Does it have autobiographical connections?
Well, you know, gosh, that's an interesting question. I think all art is autobiographical to some degree, but I think it's meant to invoke this larger context of patriarchy and military-industrial complex. I think these things are, you know, very interlinked, and a system in which sort of women are generally chaste.
But isn't there a double metaphor here that military-industrial complex in some ways has done to the civil society what patriarchy has done to women?
Yeah. I mean, that's a wonderful, I'm not going to say yes or no, I think that's your interpretation, but I think that the video lends itself, as I said, to being read precisely in that sort of multi-layered or multi-leveled way, absolutely. And the woman, of course, escapes. I had a discussion with the team that was helping me, and at one point somebody suggested, they thought that the woman should die at the end, and I said, absolutely not. And that is the twist on the film noir tradition also, you know, or rather it sort of takes film noir and traditions and sort of, you know, it's the woman who is being chased, but it is the woman in the end who escapes, not the man. So we played with a number of different, you know, Eastern and Western
But again, I'm intrigued. Why do you
ideas.
think she escapes when the man is dead? It should be she's triumphant. Why is she still escaping even when the man is dead?
Well, because I don't think that
That condition has changed?
That condition has changed,
Right.
precisely. And I also think that triumphalism suggests a kind of you know, one party winning and at the cost of the other. And I don't think that that's the kind of world that we want. We want a world in which precisely the woman doesn't need to keep escaping and the man doesn't need to be killed, or the male element doesn't need to be killed. We have to find some balance between these feminine and masculine elements. I think in the video that balance doesn't actually take place, but I think it's
That's
meant to
always
suggest.
part of a larger
Yeah.
work, yes. You know, when Faiz Ahmad Faiz, a great poet, he was in Moscow, he had an occasion to meet with Sartre, the French philosopher. And Sartre, according to Faiz Sahab, told him that the great themes of our times belong to the East and the major literary techniques belong to the West, and the great future writers will be one who will combine the two. Do you see that happening?
I do, to definitely to quite a degree. I think that one of the perhaps one of the few things that one could say are the boons of globalization are precisely that they have this globalized world has facilitated, technology has facilitated a much more rapid exchange of ideas across cultures and across national boundaries and across class and ethnicity and even gendered boundaries, so that I think artists particularly all over the world are very drawn towards experimenting with forms that are not perhaps their own indigenous forms. And this has led on, you know, in the level of music, theater, and certainly literature, to, I think, a hybridization of forms, techniques, and subject matter also, because a lot of artists and writers, of course, you know, are crossing national boundaries. They're becoming citizens, like you and I, for example, of other countries very far removed from their birthlands. And so we are in many ways very fortunate. We are enriched with so many different influences on us. And so that puts us in a position where we can, in fact, as artists, as writers, as intellectuals, as activists, really draw upon this sort of rich world of experience out there. And I do think people are trying to turn. I mean, we had one of our great, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, for example. You know, his work was it really did transcend cultural national boundaries, became very popular in the West and remained popular in the East and his own homeland. I think a lot of younger bands that we see coming up, for example, in Pakistan, are experimenting with such techniques. We had, of course, for a while, Salman Ahmed and Junoon doing a lot of that and bringing together, rock with Sufi music, with, and all these Western techniques. I mean, in my own work, certainly because I've been exposed to both sides, I try to do that or as a scholar. I try to do it as an artist, as a poet, and I feel very fortunate. On my good days, of course, on my bad days, I feel like, oh my God, I'm cut up into so many different pieces. But I think it's a wonderful thing to have access to, and I think that if we can draw on the strengths of humanity wherever it exists, that we can maybe challenge some of these rigid, narrow ideas of a sort of chauvinistic nature that this is pure and this is impure. I mean, I'd like to go beyond that.
Well, yesterday when I was last night actually, when I was trying to organize my thoughts for this discussion, I typed the word westernization, then I typed the word easternization, and the dictionary said it was not the correct word, because easternization has not been conceived as a process. So you think while the globe is being westernized, it's also being easternized?
Oh, absolutely.
And what will be some of the manifestation that you see of that?
Well, I think just what we've talked about today, I mean, the kind of work that we're seeing, you look at so many novelists, for example, that are named and have won major Western literary prizes, happen to have been raised or come from Eastern countries. Look at the work of Arundhati Roy, for example, who is an artist but also a political activist, and her work, which is very much rooted in India, both her cultural, artistic work as well as her political work, and she actually combines them so beautifully, doesn't see a difference between those two sides of that. Has made a tremendous impact on people in the West. I mean, she's like a rock star. I went to hear her once shortly after 9/11, and I mean, there must have been at least 3,000 people at Riverside Church lining up to hear what she had to say. So, writers and artists and musicians who can cross those borders are coming from the East and enriching, and they've done it, even before it became fashionable to say so. I mean, look at the Beatles back in the 60s. I mean, people like George Harrison and Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr were heavily influenced by, music of India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. And this has always gone on. So now we have perhaps a clearer sense of that trajectory. But it's happening, and I don't think it's a one-way traffic. I think that what is unfortunate is because the Western institutions are so much more powerful that they tend to dominate the scene, and so people think that really, and the West sort of swallows up all these other sort of ideas and movements and turns them into something that then they can claim for their own. But I think in recent decades, people and scholars have called attention to that, that kind of cannibalization, and are trying to reverse the process.
I am just wanting to ask you two quick questions, jumping ahead somewhat thematically. One, when we looked at the Bollywood cinema, particularly their music and their songs and their dances, where they now have a lot of European junior artists joining their group dances and songs. What is the message behind this metaphor, the new imagery of the Indian dance, where you have Salman Khan dancing with 13, junior artists from Europe?
Well, I mean, I think that I don't know that there is a message. I think Bollywood is a big commercial industry, and I think they sort of want to promote whatever is going to sell the most products and bring the largest number of audiences into the theaters. And I think that given the fact that people all over the world now have access to the material, musical or otherwise, of the West, those who live in India in this particular case, that they want to absorb that. I think that's fantastic. I mean, why should the West only be the site where other cultures and other traditions are absorbed and turned into musical extravaganzas and so on? So I think they're reversing the flow.
Okay, very interesting. There's room for more discussion. But let me ask you a very last question. And that is not a Sufi poet, but a Sufi influenced poet. In this case, I mean Faiz Ahmad Faiz, in whom we see convergence of three traditions: the Romantic tradition, the Sufi tradition, and the revolutionary tradition. What happened to that revolutionary tradition in contemporary music? Do you see that revolutionary spirit prevailing and pervading through the contemporary modern South Asian music, or you think it has been appropriated under the imperialist project?
Well, the thing is that, the imperialist, which is also the capitalist model, of course, survives because, it sort of absorbs even those movements or co-ops that happen to be counter and radical. So that is the nature of the beast. That doesn't mean that one has to stop articulating those progressive revolutionary visions. I think so. I think that there are many, not everybody, not all artists do that, but I think that there have been and there continue to be groups, and one of the examples I gave you was that of Junoon, where I think that here was a group that came out that was very revolutionary, that stood up and said, and they were banned from Pakistan for a while. They went and got the prize from India because they critiqued the establishment and the way it was going, in Pakistan. And they have used Sufi poetry and Sufi music in the context of their own sort of rock trajectory to get across a message of brotherly love and peace, and positing really a revolutionary counter ideology to the ruling ideologies of the day, both in the West as well as in the East, in this case specifically in Pakistan.
I'm practically out of time. We will leave it at that, and I hope Professor Sahib will return to this table again so we can continue our discussion. Among other things, in that session, I'd like to ask him the difference between Sufi poetry, Sufi-inspired poetry, and vulgarization and commercialization of Sufism. Thank you and goodbye.